This morning it's quite windy, so I thought it would be an opportunity to get an upload done on riding in the wind. Forecast gusts of up to about 45 miles an hour, and it is quite blustery. Constant wind speeds around about 20 to 25, but gusts of up to 40 to 45 miles per hour. Lots of people express concerns about riding in the wind, and I just wanted to put some of those concerns to rest, whilst also making sure that you're fully prepared for what may happen when it's windy. So considerations for when it's windy are: when you're stationary, you may need both feet down to cope with any of the sudden gusts. Both feet down with your front brake on, that's not a problem. Helps you to stabilise the bike. You'll feel a lot happier with your balance rather than having one foot up. With that in mind, it does help if you're organised when you're slowing down, so that you bring yourself down into first gear when you're stopping, so you don't need to then raise your foot up again to change gear. And when it's windy, if it is particularly gusty, then it is worth sitting there in first gear as opposed to popping it into neutral and then having to move your feet around again, because you might be unlucky that the moment you lift your foot is when you get a big gust and it pushes you over to the side where your foot's up. So a little bit of forward planning, thinking about the best plan of action for when it is windy and for where the wind is coming from. On any given ride you may be turning left or right, and so the wind direction according to where you're heading is going to change. So be prepared for the wind to get you from any side, because you may not take into account the fact that you've changed direction, and try and look for clues. So the flags on my left now are wavering, and I'm going to guess that the wind is going mainly from left to right, but you never know. Sometimes it's tricky to judge where the wind is coming from, and one of the hardest winds to diagnose, so to speak, is a headwind. A headwind usually makes your bike feel like it's going all over the shop. Lefty righty, lefty righty. So if you can't work out where the wind is coming from, it usually means it's directly ahead of you. This becomes especially noticeable on things like motorways where you're travelling at those higher speeds. Knowing where the wind direction is coming from and going towards is also especially helpful when you park your bike. It has been known for bikes to be blown over in the wind, so try to choose where you park it and where you direction your bike as you're parking it. Ideally, you want the bike positioned so that it's being blown onto its side stand if it's only on the side stand, if you don't have a centre stand. Alternatively, it could be positioned so that it's facing into the wind. I did come home once to find that my bike had blown over onto the bike next to it, and the bike next to it had held it up, thankfully, and it was only a little bike. It was quite a surprise that it hadn't knocked both of them over. We should be keeping our eyes open for any debris on the road and for any flying debris, whether that's things coming off the back of lorries, trailing ratchet straps off lorries, or larger vehicles that are using them, anything that could potentially be hazardous to you as a motorcyclist. It helps to keep your visor closed when it's windy, because quite often there's grit and bits of debris flying in the wind, and it will very often get into your eyes and then impede your vision. Following vehicles like skip lorries, for example, you do need to be very careful when it's windy, because quite often you'll see things flying out of the back of the lorries or from out of the top and under the tarps. Another really good reason to keep your visor down. When you're travelling in town, you need to be aware of gaps between the buildings. So when there's a junction, or just simply gaps between the buildings where the wind can come through, it's likely to push you to one side or another. So be prepared for it and try and lean into the wind. So where you can see a gap coming up, if you know it's going to push you across, try and lean into it before you even get there. Similarly, if you're in the countryside, the gaps in the hedgerows will cause a similar problem. Try to spot where the gaps are and anticipate the fact that your bike is going to change position, and you're going to need to lean into the wind to try and correct it, preferably before it happens. If you pre-lean as you're about to be buffeted, you'll find it helps and stops you from suddenly being pushed over to one side. This can be similar for bridges, or smaller bridges at least, when you're travelling on larger roads like motorways. So try and spot where you've got a more exposed area. With larger bridges taking you over open bodies of water, the wind is likely to be significantly stronger. So you do need to be aware that that is going to be more hazardous for you. It's going to push you particularly across your lane. So you either need to plan your route to avoid such bridges in exceptionally high winds, or be prepared that riding across those bridges is going to be quite a challenge. I used to live quite close to the Wales border, and I used to ride across into Wales quite regularly, and across the Chepstow Bridge particularly. Going over there when it was windy was quite a challenge. The bike would regularly be at what felt like a less than 45-degree angle, with strong winds pushing me across the two lanes. And that bridge, I don't know if it still is, but it used to be a 70-mile-an-hour limit, and it was very difficult to do the speed limits and hold the bike where you wanted it to be. At the same time, I sort of felt I wanted to get across the bridge as quickly as I could to get out of the wind. I didn't want to go too slowly because I almost felt safer going quicker. It does help to plan what you're carrying on your bike. So if you don't need your top box or you don't need your panniers and it's a particularly windy day, then take them off. Leave them at home, because they will act like a sail on the bike. They'll catch the wind and it'll push you further over to one direction or the other. When you're slowing down, you need to be aware that any strong sudden gusts of wind are going to push you more, and you're going to feel the bike move across. If anything, it's easier in the wind to keep the bike moving. So that you don't have to stop and then potentially try to hold it up as you're being buffeted in the very strong winds. If you're on a large multi-lane carriageway, then you do need to bear in mind that if you are passing large vehicles, there's going to be additional effects on the balance of the bike or the positioning of the bike caused by the wind coming around those large vehicles. This happens anyway, so whether it's windy or it isn't windy, if you pass a lorry, as you come into the back end of the lorry, you're going to be sucked in towards it, over to the left, if you're passing the lorry on your left. And then as you come out of the front end of the lorry, passing it with it on your left, it's going to push you out to the right. Now, depending on where the wind itself is actually coming from on a particularly windy day, this effect can be magnified. And you need to be aware of it so that you're prepared to be pushed into another lane or towards a central reservation. Now, if you're prepared, you can deal with it far better than if it catches you unawares. So here I'm looking at the junction thinking there could be a potential gust here because there's gaps in the hedgerows. Some fallen tree branches there, so once again just be aware that around the next bend, where you usually ride and the road is clear, particularly if there's a lot of overhanging trees, if you're in the depths of the countryside, it may not be clear around the bend. There could be overhanging branches or fallen branches. Expect the unexpected. When it's windy, it's also useful to make sure that you haven't got any loose or flapping clothing, particularly around your helmet, because the wind will catch it and then it can potentially distract you by tapping against your helmet as you're riding along or flapping in your eye line of your vision. We want to try and avoid additional distractions because we need our focus on the road ahead and all the other potential issues that the wind can cause. It's helpful to keep your handlebar grip nice and relaxed so you're not holding on too tight, but at the same time you need to be able to direct the bike and counter any potential gusts. If you're doing a long journey, it can be very tiring to ride in high winds, so plan extra time to have some breaks. It's physically tiring and it's mentally tiring because you can't really have any time where you're trying to relax. You need to be concentrating extra hard all of the time. Naked bikes are much less susceptible to the wind, however you'll still feel the gusts. So at the moment the wind is pushing me from right to left, but this bike is quite good for feeling the wind in that it doesn't really get buffeted too much. Bikes that have side fairings, so a full fairing or a half fairing, are far more likely to catch the wind in those large gusts, and it can really push you across the carriageway. So on this next stretch, this feels like a headwind because it's really against my shoulders, but I'm aware that I'm going to be weaving left and right on these bends, so it's going to change. It's not just going to be a headwind. But I still need to try to counter any large gusts when I can see any gaps in the hedgerows where it's really likely to catch me quite hard. I also need to be careful of any falling branches. These trees are overhanging the road in various places, So I need to keep my eyes open, and it's definitely tricky to hold the position that I want to hold right now, and I can really feel the buffets against my chest. I'm trying to hold position 1 because it's giving me a better view around the bend, but it was quite tricky back there. This is definitely a headwind because it's pushing me left and right at various times. So it's very strong against my chest, and it's quite tricky to hold position and to hold my head still. I'm still keeping my handlebar grip relatively relaxed, so I can easily counter steer as opposed to being totally stiff with it. So I'm keeping my elbows relaxed, and I'm trying not to hold too tight onto the handlebars whilst I navigate the wind. Watching for the gaps in the hedges. Definitely a gust there where there was a bit of a gap. And up ahead to the left there's less trees, so is it going to be more gusty because there's less trees to buffer the wind away from me? Still important to keep a close eye on what's going on behind, so that if something does happen in front, such as debris or fallen branches, you already know what's going on behind you. Now this is definitely more tiring than your average ride because of the level of wind. You also need to be prepared for your helmet to be whipped over from one side to another, and for it to be more difficult for you to do your lifesavers. A big gust can quite easily catch your helmet. A few little hanging branches here. So you need to be prepared that your head isn't going to always stay where you expect it to. So my head's being moved from left to right by the wind at the moment, which once again suggests that it is a headwind. It's also catching the chin piece of my helmet and pulling it upwards occasionally. But all of that is manageable, it's just quite tiring. And you've still got to be focused on all the things that you would normally be focused on whilst you're battling with the wind at the same time. It can be quite easy to be distracted by the wind, where actually you need to stay focused and be even more focused than normal. Coming up through the giveaway, as we bring our speed down, the wind gusts can become more noticeable and push the bike more across the lane. So we need to be aware of it and potentially be prepared to put both feet down if we're stopping. If we're not stopping, that's great. There wasn't a big gust then, but occasionally you'll get a big gust as you're travelling slowly up to the junction, and it'll just push you to one side or another. You need to be aware of it, and also be aware of the other vehicles that were around you. If somebody was pushing past then on my left and I was pushed to the left, there's the potential to have conflict with them. It's also more noisy in your helmet when it's windy. Obviously you get wind noise anyway in a helmet, but when there's additional wind and wind gusts, it becomes quite noisy. So again, that can be distracting and tiring. I've just ridden this road in one direction, and I've turned round and come back again. However, I'm not going to assume that just because the road looked clear in the other direction, that it still is in this direction, because wind can change things very quickly. So I'm still going to keep my eyes open in preparation for there to be debris or fallen branches that have happened since I turned the bike around and came back in the other direction. It was on this road that I had a front end slip relatively recently. As you can see, they've repaired the tarmac in various places, and where you can see the shiny overbanding here just to my left, it was a wet day, and just as I moved position across the shiny overbanding, the front tyre lost grip. And I've done a little short upload on that just to show you what happened, because I've never slipped on shiny tarmac before, or tarmac overbanding. I've warned students that it's slippery in the knowledge that it can be, however I've never actually slipped on it personally until relatively recently. It just goes to show that every day is a learning day, and it pays to position your bike extremely carefully when you've got that shiny overbanding, but particularly when it's new overbanding and on a wet day. I think the combination of conditions on that particular day contributed to it. Still a little bit blustery in this direction, but I suspect it was a headwind because I'm not feeling the wind quite as much now, which means it's probably behind me. And don't forget that when you're travelling behind large vehicles such as this one, there's a little bit of a slipstream there, and when the slipstream comes to an end, there's a bit of buffeting that will happen. So you'll find yourself weaving lefty righty as if you're being pushed left and right. So the best plan when you're following a large vehicle like this is not to follow it too closely. You're less likely to be affected by their slipstream and the airflow around the large vehicle. I've also had it where on large motorways on a windy day, I can feel buffets of air coming across from the other side of the carriageway when there's a large vehicle. So they really do affect the airflow on carriageways. And it's something that you need to be aware of, because it can affect your own stability and positioning within your lane. I quite enjoy the challenge of riding in the wind. I don't mind a windy day. I've never really had a problem whilst riding in the wind. Nothing particularly bad has ever happened. Perhaps because, one, I don't go out when it's ridiculously gusty. So gusts upwards of about 48 to 50 miles an hour is the top end where I would be happy riding. Anything above that, I'm going to take the car, because it's more sensible. It's easier and safer to be in a vehicle that's not going to be so negatively affected by adverse events in the wind. But I do enjoy the challenge of riding in the wind. I don't mind the gusts, I don't mind being blown about a bit. And I've learned how to deal with it by pre-angling the bike for the worst of the gusts. Try not to be afraid of riding in the wind. Be prepared for being moved around in the lane and pushed into places that you didn't perhaps expect to be pushed into. But it's about reframing your brain. Start expecting the bike to land somewhere that you didn't expect it to. Actively look for the gaps in the hedgerows or the more open areas of road, and be prepared for the bike to move in the lane or move across the lane. On higher ground, the higher you go, the more likely the wind is to become worse. So if you're coming up into high ground like Derbyshire or the Lake District, Scotland, higher peaks, the wind is going to affect your bike more than if you're on the low-lying ground. Be prepared to sacrifice your position to accommodate for the wind. So if the wind is pushing you from right to left, then try not to ride in position one, because if you get a sudden gust, you're going to be pushed into the curb or into the gutter. So it's about choosing the safest position for the conditions. Sometimes the safest position is the middle of your lane, so that if you get pushed left or right, you've still got a little bit of leeway or margin for error. The wind is certainly picking up now. It's picking my helmet, it's pushing against my shoulders and my chest. And as much as I'd like to say that I'm relaxed when I'm riding in the wind, I don't think I am relaxed when I'm riding, because I can feel that my jaw tenses up. Because of the extra concentration and the extra physical effort, I tend to start to clench my teeth a little bit and have to remind myself just to relax everything off again. So relax my elbows, relax my upper body, even though it's being pummeled by the wind. And then give yourself a break. It's hard work riding a bike when it's super windy. So stop, have a break. This road is notoriously gusty. The wind usually whips across from the trees on the right, pushing you over to the left. It wasn't too bad today, actually. Unusual. You can see how fast the river's moving, however. And the wind turbine's having a little happy moment. Now I can feel the wind, so I'm leaning my bike into the wind, which is towards the right, so that I don't get pushed over into the river. Always helpful.